There had been few safety regulations or density requirements for multi-family tenement housing. The buildings were cheaply constructed, with little concern for fireproofing. Living spaces in these buildings were frighteningly overcrowded since the density, how many people could live in a certain amount of space, went unregulated. Thousands of immigrants coming through Ellis Island to start a new life in America found affordable housing in these unsafe buildings, and landlords were happy to let them fit as many in a living space as possible, as long as they paid their rent. If a resident became exposed to diseases like smallpox or tuberculosis, it would rapidly spread throughout the building. If the water became contaminated, the whole building would become ill. When mold and mildew grew rampant, the building became flagrantly unsafe. Tenement conditions ensured the human toll ended up much worse than in other, more well-tended dwelling types. Prior to New York City's requirement that each tenement must have indoor toilets, residents of the overcrowded buildings had to use outhouses in the backyards. The outhouses, like the ones pictured here, were packed into an already tight backyard space. Tenement dwellers might have found 4 outhouses for every 100 people. They had to endure long lines, little privacy, and weren't cleaned on a regular basis. In desperate cases or in particularly cold or icy conditions, residents would skip the outhouses altogether and use a chamber pot. While chamber pots could be emptied into the outhouses as they filled up, some residents just dumped the chamber pots into the yard or into the air shaft, adding to the already unsanitary conditions of the area. While New York City had the capability to provide fresh water to residential units in the late 1800s and remove waste through a sanitation system, the demand for these services overwhelmed the system. The people in the overcrowded units had no reliable water. The 1894 Tenement House Committee found almost no water being supplied to residents. Residents couldn't bathe even if they wanted to. The lack of washing and the buildup of garbage and waste in backyards and air shafts created a superhighway for contamination. Disease, once it took hold in a tenement, grew impossible to stop. The transoms over doors were intended to help natural air flow to mitigate some of these problems, but the transoms merely opened up units to the contaminated garbage air. And the transoms came with trouble of their own. They made fires harder to contain. The tight, overcrowded tenement buildings were under a constant threat of fire. Tenements were typically mixed-use buildings. Stores and services took up space on the street level, and the residential units were accessible through a doorway next to the store, then up a single set of narrow, wooden stairs. Some of the commercial units on the first story posed a particular fire hazard. Bakeries, especially when they used fats and oils to create their food, posed a particular threat. Storage and warehouses held combustible goods. Hay and feed for the horses could ignite. If not safely stored, the resulting fire could wipe out a whole tenement. When something in a tenement broke, it frequently stayed broken. The landlords had little incentive, or in some cases, money, to fix it. Nor did the residents. In this image, the walls are dilapidated and chipped. The bed is nothing more than a metal frame, although the bed itself is reasonably neatly made, and the floor picked up, showing an effort to take care of their living space. An article of clothing or a towel hangs from a nail or hook above the bed, and a warped shelf contains the few personal treasures visible in the image, including an American flag. But of greater concern is the broken window with shards of pointed glass looming over the bed. The lack of an attempted fix shows a lack of care by the property owners and landlords to properly maintain the dwelling units. The force of change weighed heavily on New York's tenement districts. Pre-law, and old law, tenement standards, referring to those attempted reforms in 1867 and 1879, were no longer acceptable. Air shafts had to be provided and the buildings couldn't be sited so compactly anymore. After the new law, the 1901 Tenement Housing Act aka New Law, tenements needed reasonable open space on the lot to allow air and light inside the building and access this light and air via windows from each unit. The new law tightened safety measures in tenement design, maintenance standards, and safety regulations than its predecessors. This concerned landlords and property owners, who rushed to build their old law-style buildings before the new law went into effect. There was a rush of old law tenements constructed in haste, making 1901 a remarkably busy year for tenement construction. Reforms, acts, and inspections weren't working. The pictures from the New York City Tenement House Department documented many of these poor living conditions between 1902 and 1914, after the new law went into effect. But tenements, with the occasional reform effort, continued to house the impoverished and new arrival, and landlords continued to neglect their properties. But in the 1950s, cities were enthusiastically embracing a new trend in reform: urban renewal. Urban renewal was a federal program that allocated federal money to cities, who used these funds to clear blighted areas of their community. It was an attempt to modernize and eliminate problem areas in major urban areas across the United States. Since tenements, always a thorn in New York City's side, were among the most blighted properties, many of them were cleared out in the 1950s and 60s, until the program faded in the 1970s.